More information on that as we get it here on Sky News. Now, the actress Sheila Hancock has said that she's already paid for a care home, so her daughters don't have to be lumbered with looking after her when she gets older. And with the government now saying that 1 in 6 of us are predicted to live until the age of 100, it's an issue more and more of us are likely to have to consider. So this morning we're asking who in ageing Britain should care for our parents. Here to talk it over, we have the writer for Conservative Woman, Caroline Farrow, and editor of Grahamsnet, Carrie Rosen. And good morning to you both. This is an interesting conversation to have. It's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but after this report out today saying 1 in 6 of us are going to live until we are 100, it's about time we had a national conversation. Caroline, how are people viewing looking after elderly relatives at the moment? Is it a burden or a privilege?
I think most people are sadly seeing it as a burden, but actually I think I would remind everyone that looking after children is a burden, but just because something is difficult doesn't necessarily make it unfulfilling or unrewarding. And it's certainly something that we've thought about in my family. So my nana lived until the age of 99. She died just a month before her 100th birthday, and she lived with my mum and dad for 30 years. And actually, it's one of the things my husband and I have talked about when it comes to our parents. I think where possible, we believe that it's actually, the child's responsibility to do what they can. Now, sometimes, people do require care and they do need to go into homes. So my nana went into the home for the last year of her life because my father had had a massive heart attack. My mum was in her early 70s and caring for 2 people was almost impossible. But actually, I think we need to have a radical rethink, and instead of wanting to automatically put people into homes or thinking that you're going to need a home, perhaps we need to structure the tax system so that people are encouraged to look after people in their own homes, as always used to be the case, actually. It shouldn't be that we automatically delegate this responsibility to the state, to the third parties.
Yeah, we'll talk about government funding in a moment. The Business Secretary has confirmed that £300 million worth of investment is going in to make sure the UK leads the world in healthy ageing and how to look after us all as we get a lot older, basically. Carrie, do you think as a nation we have to look at this differently? I mean, Caroline was using words there like burden, responsibility. Do we need to change the attitude here?
I think it's partly about attitude and partly about changes in society. These days people have smaller families, there are less children to perhaps group together to look after an ageing parent. We're having to work a lot later.
Geographically, we're spread around now, whereas years ago we perhaps weren't as much.
Yeah, and also people having to work, often up to, my mum's still working at 77, and when her mother was 98 when she died, needed care. My mum was in her mid-70s and it was her pleasure to do everything for her mum, but she physically couldn't be there 24/7 to do it. She was still working and it was too much. And as we get older, our children who are in this position are also going to get older, and you can't ask 70 and 80-year-olds to care 24/7 for somebody who needs it. Yeah,
Caroline, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in an ideal world, I'm sure everybody would like to look after their parents up until the point of death as best as they can. But on a practical element, if your parents have dementia, if they have a disability, if they need specialist care, if you're working, you've got children yourself, perhaps grandchildren yourself at this stage, it's an impossibility for many people.
Absolutely, and I'm not saying that people are necessarily neglectful, but I do think that actually there is a lot of reciprocity to be had. Our parents looked after us when we were young and dependent, and I think we have a kind of obligation to do the same. But recognising how society is changing, I think we need to move away from the system of care homes and actually move towards a package where people can be better supported to look after their relatives themselves in their home environments, and that's better for the elderly person, because very often I see a lot of this myself. I see people going into homes who are completely mentally sharp and they have the acuity and and they're in homes, whereas in the best will in the world, they're not going to get necessarily the same amount of stimulation, they're not going to keep active, whereas actually when you're sort of cared for in your own home, there's more impetus, there's more stimulation, and and the joy from family relationships as well. And my mum will tell you she feels very guilty about having putting her mother into a home for the last year of her life, although she didn't effectively have a choice. But she made sure she visited every day with magazines and flowers. So I think if your relative is in a home, you know, that doesn't mean your responsibility.
It's quite
towards
interesting,
men.
actually. I'm reading a book at the moment about the Japanese way of life, and they talk about how long they live. I think it's Okinawa in Japan. Everybody lives there until a ripe old age, past 100. And two of the key factors in that, they say, is a purpose, so something to get up for in the morning, and social interaction. Carrie, do you think we need innovative ways of looking at what's being described as a ticking time bomb in care of the elderly? I mean, government funding is one thing. Workplaces giving allowances to relatives who have elderly relatives, because obviously you get childcare allowances, maternity, paternity leave. Should we think about things like that? I was just reading in the Times today about the proposals for the first purpose-built dementia village in Kent. Plans for that are going through to be developed by the year 2020. Are these the kind of things we should be thinking about?
Yes, I mean, I think it needs a radical rethink, absolutely. It's very difficult because so many people are working, as I've said, to, you know, late 60s, even 70s, simply to pay the mortgage. And if they can't do that because they're looking after a relative, they're going to be a burden on the state in a different way. And it's all very well and good for Sheila Hancock, and I can see it came from the best place possible to, you know, thinking of her daughters, to say, I've chosen my care home.
Yes, she doesn't want it to be a burden. I mean, we've
Yes.
not heard her daughter's side of the story. Her daughters might be...
And I feel the same to my daughter, and I know my mother feels the same to me. And, you know, with a lot of love, there'll never be a burden, but the physical burden is a different thing to the emotional burden.
OK, Carrie, Caroline, that's all we've got time for. Just want to read out a couple of tweets. A lot of you getting in touch about this. Christine Taylor said, I lived with my mum for the last few months of her life until she went into the hospice. It was an honour to spend that time with her, and I learnt things I never knew about her. Plus, she arranged and paid for her funeral. Yesterday was the first Mother's Day without her. Sending our best wishes to you, Christine. And Alan Hughes says, it would be a privilege to care for the people who have unreservedly cared for us as children from birth and continue to do so daily in one way or another while they are still around. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us about that issue this morning, Carrie Rosen and Caroline Farrow.